Alrighty folks, want to welcome you back to another video from Yates Computers Tips and Reviews. Want to remind everybody, head on over, hit the subscribe, hit the bell, keep those updates coming when the new videos come out. So, last video was CPU. Year of the rabbit hole. Here we go. So, covered the CPU, talked a little bit about the motherboard. Mentioned on the last video, it's kind of a funny thing again to mention, as for drives, SATA drives, you no longer need a physical SATA drive, you don't need an IED drive, you don't need any external component drives in your computers anymore. It's kind of a funny thing to think of and to say out like that. And this is where the rabbit hole effect comes into the motherboard again. Because it's not only what memory you can have, it's not only the CPU it can handle, it's not the cooling package that it can handle, it's not how many memory sticks it can handle, it's now how many drives you can put on that motherboard. It's now what size motherboard do you need? Form factors have changed over the years. How these things have been done. Have an unboxing on this little one I have here that I have for capturing my videos and doing that type of stuff. This little tiny computer does not have a SATA drive in it. It does. I don't believe it has a full M.2 drive in it. It has one of the smaller ones. I haven't opened it up to look. So now you have M.2 drives out. Come in different sizes. Have videos on that. This is a whole different environment now for things like this. Now you have cards that can go into the slot that can hold 1, 2, 8 M.2 drives. Your motherboard will have to be able to support that with the buses and the channels from the CPU. I've talked about that in the CPU video. Memory, how many memory slots, where they're located, buses, channels, goes back to not only your CPU, but the actual motherboard. Having the proper slots on the back that you're going to need. USB, USB 3, C, Firewire, all of those things need channels and buses and all of these things from your CPU, and that all goes through your motherboard. All these SATA connectors. These might be a thing that might not be around very long. Unless they come out with a SATA drive that's capable with, the new or the old spinning mechanical. That might be the only reason to have SATA drive ports, is for the spinning mechanical. SATA drives are dropping in price pretty fast right now. If you don't have one in an older computer, it might be worth looking at upgrading and converting over. They're getting pretty cheap for some good brands out there. So, but then you also have Windows 11, Windows 12 coming around the corner, that if you have an older computer that's not going to be compatible, it's probably not too bad to spend 40 or 50 bucks to upgrade the drive to get that speed out of it for the next year or two before you have to upgrade to a new computer. 40 or 50 bucks is not a bad price. Some of them, I believe, are $39, $36 right now. It's pretty incredible, some of these prices that I've seen. So, and that's because of the M.2 being available on motherboards. That the SATA drives are getting pretty much phased out. And that brought me to the rabbit hole subject, back to the motherboard. Knowing your power supply, how much power is being provided to that board, all of those factors come into play with your motherboard. So this is really just the little rabbit hole type of subject I wanted to bring up. It's something you're going to have to do homework on. It's not a whole lot I can cover all in a video because there's a lot of technicalities, a lot of technical stuff, because depending on what you do and how you want it to be is a whole different variable. That's the rabbit hole. That there is not one simple answer. Go out, buy a 1,000-watt power supply and buy this specific board and buy this specific card and you'll have no problem. There is. Yeah, you can say that, but you're going to go out and spend $3,000 on these parts, $4,000 on these parts that you might not need. So it's kind of an issue that's out there that I thought was kind of interesting. One of the computers that I was working that came in had 3 M.2s on the board, and it had an insert card that had one. And I kind of thought, well, that was kind of silly. Why wouldn't you just put bigger sized M.2 drives in there? Why do you need 4? How are you supposed to configure these? How are they supposed to be in a useful manner? So that might be something that when you're looking at computers, I mentioned maybe you get 2 4 terabyte drives in there. How do you need them? You stripe them, put them together as an 8 terabyte. Maybe you put in a partition for your OS, partition for storage. Whatever it is, you can actually RAID them. You can do other things. So you have the redundancy and the protection. There's different things you can do all off that motherboard now. And again, if you're planning to do RAID and you're planning to do other things like that, that gets back into the rabbit hole of the motherboard. You want to make sure the motherboard supports it. I'm sure you can buy cards that go in there. I know I've seen them, but they're quite expensive, where you can put in multiple M.2s and do RAID on the card. There's factors out there, these add-on cards. I have a video about add-on cards and ports and all of that type of stuff, and making sure your case supports all of that, the slots and all of that type of stuff also come into play. Knowing those little factors on the motherboard itself can save you a lot of headache and a lot of stress. A lot of, okay, let me now figure out how I can get what I want and how I can do this. It's just by looking at a motherboard. A lot of older motherboards with drives, spinning mechanical drives, used to let you RAID certain kind of RAID configurations without having to have a standalone RAID card. If you're interested in those kind of features, you have to do your research on the motherboard. Make sure that motherboard actually supports it. And that's why I'm covering this again in the rabbit hole year. So that everybody is fully aware of, it's not a simple little, I'm just going to run out and buy this board because I'm getting an i9 13th gen DDR5. Then you have, is it 3rd generation or 4th gen M.2? The speeds of it. All of those things come into factor. Bus on the board. The newer generation CPUs should support the newer software, the newer hardware. Again, if you get out and get 11th gen processor, 11th gen board, it's probably not going to support the new M.2. So this is where you have some variables there. Maybe you don't need the 4th gen and you can get away with 3rd gen with the speed because you're going to have it 4 years, 5 years, and you know you're going to change. Maybe that's part of your business plan. Maybe that's part of your lifestyle, whatever. But the odds are, as fast as these CPUs are right now, you're probably going to have it for a long time. A lot of people out there probably have some really old generation CPUs out there now. Dual core, barely 4 core, dual core with hyper threaded, that they've been running for a long time. And you go out and buy one of these new ones at like 18 cores, 16 cores, 40 core, you're going to be blown away with the speed, with the M.2. When I got the new one at work, we were like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, it was so fast, it kept throwing us off. So, wanted to go through that because that is a major factor, is the motherboard. If you get into gaming, there are boards designed more for gaming. Of course, servers, there are boards designed for servers. Workstations have workstation boards that are designed for workstation. Home use usually has a board that's kind of designed an all-around unit for home use. What size computer do you want? Little dinky? Medium? Standard? Full tower? I had a full tower for years that was as high as this desk. That thing was my heater. That thing, you turned on, whoop, it heated up everything. How many drives you're going to need? A lot of these factors come into this. Maybe, like I said, this is the time you don't need those SATA drives. Maybe you have a lot of SATA drives in there. Making sure you have enough SATA ports. Of course, there's always add-on cards you can add on. Having that on the motherboard, making sure you have the future growth potential by having those add-on slots. So that, I believe, covers most of motherboards. What the rabbit hole issue is to the motherboard. Making sure you understand the DDR4, DDR5 differences. There are boards that are out there that are pretty much identical Intel-wise. AMD is not. The new AMD processors, I believe, only support DDR5. But as for Intel, I believe you have both choices. You can get the CPU, motherboard, and memory either in DDR5 or DDR4 compliance. I'm not too sure the differences in the CPU. It might be the same CPU, but I know the motherboard and the memory are different. They're different boards. So you may want to watch out for that, because maybe you're looking at an Extreme Edition CPU. Maybe that does not really support DDR4 due to bus speeds or amount of buses or whatever it is. So I wanted to point that out because the buses and stuff are on the board. They're not on the CPU. They're on the board and the sockets on the board, the add-on slots. Understanding where the buses and the channels are, they are on the motherboard. But you have to have those features available on the CPU also. But the actual physical buses and channels that communicate from the CPU to the hardware are on the motherboard. So that's the rabbit hole. That's one that I guess people pretty much expect it to be self-explanatory. But wanted to go through and point that out because that's not something I hear people actually telling people. This is actually on the motherboard. Yes, your CPU has to have the features, your CPU has to support it, but that is on the motherboard. I hear them talk about memory positions and all of that stuff closer to the CPU and all. But when it communicates out to your add-on slots and communicates out to your M.2s, that's all on your motherboard. Again, also knowing what your power requirements are is due to your motherboard, because those M.2 drives pull the power from the motherboard. They're not hooked to your power supply like the drives used to be, the SATA drives. So that can be a factor between the two. But again, M.2 drives will run a lot faster than SATA. So, gone on long enough. I think I've covered pretty much everything I need to cover for the rabbit hole effect of a motherboard. Because it can get a little confusing when you go in. Especially if you go in and say, I've got an Intel i7 this gen and I want to buy a motherboard, and they say, okay, which one? And you give them the make and model, and then they go, okay, I need more information. You might get lost. You might, what do you mean more information? Because you've done your homework, you've done your research, but you didn't realize there's 2 different kinds, or maybe 3 different kinds. Because you have your standard processor, you have your extreme processor, you have your DDR4, you have your DDR5. Maybe how many M.2 slots. Maybe there's a variable in different boards. So knowing these things, making sure everybody does their homework, because the worst thing you want to do is go into the store and say, I want this motherboard. The guy goes, yeah, no problem. Goes back there, gives it to you, gets what you want. You go get your DDR4, go get your DDR5. You get home, you open it up, you go through all this hassle putting it on, you heat sink, all this stuff, and then it won't boot. And then you go and you start researching, why won't this boot? Why won't this boot? Well, maybe because he gave you a DDR4 board and you bought DDR5. Well, you asked for the board that supported DDR5. Did you? You asked for a motherboard. He went and got you that motherboard, but that motherboard supported DDR4 and the other one to support DDR5. Versions that were different. He didn't understand. He's the guy that works in the store, went and got you what you asked for. So that's the rabbit hole. And then it costs you money to remedy that problems, because you can't return it because you've already opened it and used it. So knowing these little things, I hope that help you out, because if you had that problem and you go home and you're trying to do that, it takes you a week, 3 weeks, 4 weeks to troubleshoot, to wonder what's going on. You're going online, trying to do research, trying to figure out what happened, and then you figure out, oh man, I asked the guy for this, but this is what he gave me and that's not what I needed. That's why I'm doing this video, because it might come up in a different way than you expect. Not understanding those small little variables. If you go out and bought a CPU, went out for an i7, i9, they didn't have the exact one. Oh, but we have this one that's pretty close to the same. They give you an extreme. That board doesn't support the extreme for some weird reason. BIOS, chipset, whatever it is. Too much for the board. Doesn't work. Well, that's actually the CPU issue, but it is related to the motherboard because the motherboard doesn't support it. Same with DDR4, DDR5. That one is more noticeable because the DDR5 should not fit in the DDR4 slot. So you'll run into that problem from the get-go. Most of the time, that should be the most noticeable thing, that it doesn't fit. whatever other little technical issues there are. But these are some of those problems that can come up. Understanding the motherboard and the wormhole, rabbit hole effect of that motherboard can be quite amazing. The platform, the style. If you buy a case, maybe it doesn't fit in the case because it's a different form factor. Knowing these things, knowing your cooling package, where you're going to put, if you have water cooled or air cooled, radiator on top, radiator on bottom, radiator on back. I'll have a cooling video on that. I'm sure everybody knows all of that. But knowing the motherboard, where it's placed, if you have your cooler up top and you have your CPU and everything right on top here that's going to block your cooling, that's your motherboard. You want to double check all of those things. You want to make sure it fits in the case properly. Maybe you have to look at a different make and model due to what you need to. Or you got to look at a different case. That's some of these factors that deal with motherboards. Where all of this is physically placed when you put it in your case can be a factor. I know I was going to wrap this up. I'm going to wrap it up now. But do your homework, do your research on all these factors because, again, this changes. Today, you might have no problems with any motherboard you go out there and buy. Next month, they might have a whole new release, whole new revision of these motherboards where some of these issues can come up. And you've done your homework. You understand, oh, okay, this will fit in this case. This will be perfect. And you go out, oh, no, there's a new revision of this board. You buy that board, you run into a weird issue. So, welcome to the rabbit hole year. Make sure you hit the subscribe. Make sure you hit the bell. Make sure you forward my links from Yates Computers Tips and Reviews. Thank you so much.